That morning, what seemed like a routine rescue turned into something I never could have imagined. A dog trapped in a manhole, a common call that came over our radio. I was used to rescuing animals, doing whatever it took. But there was something about this mission that couldn't stop bothering me. The dog was agitated, desperate, more so than I'd ever seen him. It wasn't just fear, there was an intensity in his eyes, as if he knew he was in danger, but also that something even deeper was at play. And what I didn't realize at the time was that he wasn't just asking for help, he was guiding us. As the team tried to remove the manhole cover, the dog began to move more vigorously, his barking mixed with sounds of agony. But at the same time, he seemed to want to go deeper, closer to whatever was keeping him trapped. It was as if he were trying to say, "Go deeper, follow me, there's something here you need to see." It was when we finally managed to get him out of the manhole that things began to change. The dog, exhausted and dirty, seemed to want to escape, but before he was taken away, he made a strange movement. His paws were covered in mud, but when he stood up, I noticed something unusual. Between his toes, something glistened. It was a small object, covered in dirt, but with distinct markings I'd never seen before. I was the first to pick up the artifact. It was heavy, with ancient inscriptions that moved as if they had a life of their own. A strange sensation ran through me, as if I were touching something I shouldn't, something far beyond simply rescuing an animal. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment, that object, and that dog were about to change my life forever. What seemed like a simple task, saving a lost dog, would turn into a journey of mystery, danger, and revelations that would take me to places I never could have imagined. And then, as I stared at the object, trying to understand what was happening, the dog looked at me one last time. It wasn't just any look. It was as if he knew my life would never be the same. Something bigger was lurking. Something I could no longer ignore. The tension I felt in that moment was palpable. Something had been awakened. But what? And why was that dog involved? I always imagined my work as a rescuer as a way to do good, to help when needed, to save lives. That's what I always thought, at least until that day. Until the moment when the simple act of rescuing a dog became a journey I wasn't prepared for. My name is Ricardo, and I've been a first responder for years. In many ways, I've lived an ordinary life. I have a simple home, a stable routine, and a family that, no matter how difficult, has always been there for me. The work gave me a purpose, and over the years, I learned not to question it too much. Not at first, at least. The missions were routine. Most people, when they met me, thought the work was easy, just saving lives, you know. But the truth was different. Behind every rescue were untold stories, scarred lives, losses that never ceased to haunt me. That day started like any other. I was just starting my shift and my mind was already elsewhere, perhaps thinking about what would happen later or how tired I was. But the radio called us, a dog stuck in a manhole. The distance was short, so we decided to respond as quickly as possible. Nothing I hadn't done 1,000 times. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was the tension in the air. The street was deserted, and the people gathered around the manhole were silent, almost as if they were waiting for something. It wasn't the desperate barking you normally hear. It was a sound, something lower, heavier. The dog was down there, struggling, desperately trying to get out, but in a way that felt different, as if he were trying to do more than simply escape. At that moment, I looked at my team's faces. They were all focused on the rescue, but there was something in their eyes, a shadow, as if they sensed something was wrong. It wasn't normal. Something inside me began to stir. Maybe it was just my instinct, but it felt like there was more to this rescue than I could see. The dog was removed with difficulty, and for a moment, relief washed over everyone. But I soon realized something was far from over. When he was placed on the ground, his behavior was completely unusual. He didn't move like a normal dog. He was watching, focusing on me, his eyes fixed, almost as if he were trying to say something. That's when I saw what was between its paws, stuck in the mud. An object. A small object, but it gave off a sense of something much deeper. Something older, darker. I hesitated for a moment, but, as always, curiosity got the better of me. I took the object in my hands, and immediately felt its weight. This wasn't a simple find. It wasn't just a piece of metal or stone. The inscriptions were strange, almost as if they had a life of their own, changing as I looked at them. Something there was moving, but not physically. It was as if it were alive. And the worst part, I knew there was something more behind it all. Something that wasn't meant to be found, something the dog knew, something he was trying to show. The tension in my chest grew with each passing second. But at that moment, I didn't know how that would change everything. Now, when I look back on that moment, I realize that it was there that the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary blurred. It was there that I began to lose myself. What seemed like just another day at work, a simple mission to rescue a dog, turned into something I never, ever could have predicted. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, that dog's gaze still haunted me. It wasn't just because he was a lost animal. It was because he knew something, and now I knew it too. Something was happening. Something beyond any rational explanation. That night, as I stared at the object on the table, the feeling of unease grew. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What did it mean? What was happening? The inscriptions on the object, which I initially thought were just where marks or a meaningless drawing, were starting to seem more dynamic. I swore the lines were shifting, moving in a way I couldn't explain. I knew it wasn't something ordinary, but what was it? For the first few days, I tried to ignore the object, focusing on work and my routine, but I couldn't look away. It was always there, a constant presence, reminding me of something I didn't yet understand. Every time I looked at it, I felt a weight in my stomach. It was as if it were challenging me to move forward, as if it were asking me to understand. That's when I decided to seek help. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't simply let the mystery unfold without at least trying to understand. I started talking to some people who, despite my previous knowledge, had a deeper understanding of ancient artifacts and the city's history. I went to an antique dealer who, by chance, seemed like the kind of person who would know what to do with such objects. The man, named Pedro, was older, with a long beard and deeply tired eyes. He didn't take long to look at the object, and as soon as he touched it, his face turned pale. This shouldn't be here," he said, more to himself than to me. He recoiled, almost as if he'd touched a venomous snake. I asked him to explain, but he was evasive. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to get involved. This, of course, only heightened my curiosity. What did he know that I didn't? With each conversation, the feeling that something was wrong only grew. Each person I consulted seemed to know more than they were willing to tell me. It was as if there were a pact of silence, something being protected by an invisible net of fear. And with each step I took, the mystery grew deeper, darker. I tried to understand, but the answers were ever more distant. The feeling that I was being watched also grew. I began to notice faces in places I shouldn't have, footsteps following mine. Was I becoming paranoid? Or was something or someone actually following me? When I realized I was being followed by a man in a dark overcoat, with a hat covering his face, I could no longer ignore it. Fear gripped me. This person didn't seem like just a curious person. He was watching me closely, and it wasn't long before we were exchanging furtive glances. He seemed to know something I didn't. I was being pulled into something I didn't want to understand, but I no longer had a choice. The man disappeared around a corner before I could approach him, but his presence remained with me. Every time I glanced down the street, he was there, in the distance, watching. And then it happened. One night, upon returning home, I found a note on my door. It was simple, but the words were clear as a warning: leave the object, or what you found will find you. A chill ran down my spine. I knew I had to return the artifact. I knew whatever happened next wasn't something I should continue investigating. But deep down, something told me that now that I had started, I couldn't stop. Something much bigger was at stake, and if I backed away now, I might never know the truth. Questions began to pile up, and answers seemed further away than ever. I knew my next move would be crucial. But with each passing day, the mystery grew more intricate and the sense of danger more palpable. I was at a point of no return, and what happened next would change my life forever. With the note on the door, the pressure to move on or give up had never been so intense. I was gripped by fear, but also by curiosity. And that was what kept me going, even though I knew what I was doing was somehow risky. At the same time, the threats began to mount, more menacing and palpable. Something was approaching me, like a shadow I couldn't see but felt with every fiber of my being. I decided to investigate further what was happening. Not just the artifact, but what it represented. What had been buried there, in those streets, beneath that city. Over the next few nights, I searched for more information, more clues, but each discovery only increased my fear. Yet, with each new clue, a sense of urgency gripped me, as if the truth were pushing me toward a fate I could not escape. It was then that, in an ancient library, I found a reference that began to make sense. A passage in a book obscured by time spoke of a legend that existed deep within the city. Something related to ancient rituals and cults that had been buried in the shadows of history. The Circle of the Earth, as it was called, was a sect that believed a greater power existed, hidden from all, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. I was beginning to understand. The artifact wasn't just a key, it was the key to a cycle, to something that had been guarded for generations, something that was waiting for the right moment to be released. And that moment was now. But I wasn't the only one searching for the truth. Those in the cult, who had been in hiding for generations, began following me more closely. They already knew I was getting closer to uncovering everything. And it wasn't long before they began acting more aggressively. I'd been followed for days, but that night, the threat became clear. As I walked home, after another search, I felt a presence behind me. Something heavy, a sense of impending danger that made me quicken my steps. As I turned the corner, one of the cult members suddenly appeared. His face was covered, but the energy emanating from him was cold, almost frightening. "You know what you found," he said, his voice deep and measured. "You're messing with forces you don't understand." I tried to back away, but he stepped closer, blocking my path. The tension in the air was palpable. The street was deserted, and I could feel the weight of threat on my shoulders. "You cannot stop what is already in motion. What has been awakened cannot be erased," he continued, almost whispering. "I suggest you return the artifact, or the consequences will be severe." It was the first time someone from the cult had revealed themselves to me so directly. He was challenging me. I didn't know if I should run or fight, if I was ready to face what was coming. He smiled, sensing my hesitation. "It won't do any good, Ricardo. The city is already being swallowed by this. What you've begun to discover, there's no going back." The man then walked away, disappearing into the night. But his words stayed with me, haunting me. I knew the cult wasn't just watching me anymore. They were hunting me. And the artifact I held in my hands wasn't just a lost object. It was the catalyst for something much larger, something I had no control over. That night, the weight of the decision fell upon me brutally. What did I do now? What should I do with the artifact? I had the power to destroy everything or unleash a force that could devastate the entire city. There were no easy choices anymore. And worst of all, I knew none of this was a coincidence. I was at the center of something much bigger, something I could no longer escape. The tension was about to explode. What happened next would change the course of my life. And perhaps everyone around me. I had a feeling something imminent was about to happen, but the truth was, I barely knew what was truly at stake. That cult, the threats, the clues I'd found, all of this was just the beginning of something much bigger, more complex, and more terrifying than I could have imagined. And at that moment, there was no turning back. After that encounter with the cultist, things began to take an increasingly dark turn. I knew the artifact wasn't just a physical key, but a key to an ancient power, something buried in the city for centuries. But what I didn't yet understand was how all of this connected to my own story, to my life. That morning, when I went to work, a sense of urgency gripped me. Something was happening. I could feel it in the air. And as I entered the building, I found something that made my heart freeze, a photo on my desk. It was an old yellowed photo showing a building downtown, a building I had never seen before. But that wasn't what made me tremble. What made me tremble was the writing on the back. You don't know what you're looking for, but we do. You belong here. It was a warning. But not from just anyone. It was a warning from within the cult. From someone who knew exactly who I was. And that was the moment when it all made sense, or at least part of it did. The cult wasn't just after the artifact. They were after me. I wasn't just accidentally involved. I was part of it. I looked at the artifact, which sat on my desk, and that's when I realized the connection. The artifact wasn't just a piece of an ancient ritual. It was tied to a lineage, to a family. And without knowing it, I had been pulled into a destiny that wasn't mine, but one that had been destined for me all along. I decided to go to the city library, where I found the earliest records of this story, dating back centuries. I began piecing together the pieces, trying to understand what was happening. The worship, the artifact, the city, everything was connected. But the most shocking thing came when I found a reference to a name that made me choke. Ricardo Oliveira. My name. There, written in large letters. In the middle of an old diary, with the date of an event I couldn't believe. According to the record, the cult had been formed many years ago, and the most important member of this sect was a direct ancestor of mine. Something I didn't know, something my family had kept hidden for generations. I belonged to this cult. My lineage was intertwined with the founders of the sect that worshipped the hidden power beneath the city. I, unknowingly, was part of it all. At first, the thought that I was involved in something so dark sent a wave of panic through me. But as reality set in, a different feeling took hold. I could no longer run. It was as if everything, from the beginning, had been leading me to this point. And at that moment, the great revelation arrived with the certainty that, now, there was no escape. I wasn't just trying to stop evil. I was part of it. The feeling of being watched had never been so intense. I knew I could no longer trust anyone. Everything I knew was being destroyed before my eyes. The cult knew who I was. They already knew everything. But the biggest question still lingered. Why me? Why was I chosen to carry the artifact? What did this mean for me and everyone around me? The revelation that I was part of a bloodline connected to the cult was the turning point. In that moment, a sense of dread washed over me. I could no longer deny the truth. Destiny had chosen me. And somehow, I could no longer escape it. The cult knew who I was, and they were getting closer and closer. Not only watching me, but preparing to do what they wanted. The photo left on my desk, the note, everything indicated I was being hunted. And it wasn't about the artifact anymore. It was about me. They wanted me to follow them, to surrender to the fate already set. But there was something inside me that still told me to fight. Worst of all, the city seemed to be being affected. People around me were beginning to disappear, one by one, without explanation. The feeling that something was about to spiral out of control was taking over. The cult, with its silent presence, was beginning to take over in a subtle way. Fear was in the eyes of the people, but no one knew what was really happening. The entire city was about to be swallowed by something much larger. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't stand by any longer while they prepared to unleash what they wanted. I needed to understand how this was all connected and, if possible, prevent the worst from happening. I remembered the stories I'd found about the Earth Circle, about the power that lay dormant beneath the city. The artifact I held wasn't just a simple symbol, it was the key to something much greater, something that had been guarded for centuries. But the city was beginning to reveal its secrets, and I knew time was running out. I decided to follow a new lead. An old, abandoned building, seemingly harmless, but which seemed to have been the center of several mysterious activities in the past years. I was aware that there was something there, something that could give me the answer I so desperately sought. But upon arriving at the location, I realized I wasn't alone. The atmosphere was charged. Every step I took seemed to be followed by a shadow. When I entered the building, the smell of mold and desolation was suffocating. But most disturbing was the silence. The building seemed empty, but there was a sense that something was waiting for me inside. I didn't know what, but the atmosphere was permeated with the feeling that something very big and very dangerous was about to happen. I explored every corner of the building until finally I found a staircase that descended into a deep basement. A shiver ran down my spine. The air below was even denser. As I descended, the light from my phone barely illuminated the way. But at the bottom, I saw what appeared to be a secret entrance, an old altar. That's when I heard the noise. Like a voice whispering in my ear. Something was speaking to me, telling me to turn back, to stop. Fear gripped me, but an even greater force pushed me forward. I knew that if I stopped now, I would never know the truth. And deep down, something inside me told me there was no turning back. I was at the center of it all. The cult knew I'd come this far, and now the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. But what I discovered in that basement, before that altar, it left me speechless. The inscriptions I'd seen on the artifact, which I'd thought were just mysterious markings, were now visible all over the altar wall. And worse still, they were beginning to glow. With each passing second, the words moved, and the room seemed to pulse with a growing energy. What was about to happen, there was something I had no control over. It was a power about to be unleashed. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. And before I could react, I heard a familiar voice, cold and distant, coming from the shadows. "Now you understand," the voice said, and I knew deep down that there was no turning back. This was no longer just a city. No longer a simple investigation. The hidden power the cult craved was rising. And somehow, I was at the epicenter of this dark revolution. The tension in that moment was almost unbearable. I stood in a shadowy place, before an ancient altar, surrounded by symbols and inscriptions that seemed to come to life as I gazed at them. I knew the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, but I never imagined it would be so devastating. The voice coming from the shadows, cold and calculated, made me freeze. "Now you understand," he repeated, once more, with an authority that paralyzed me. I turned slowly, unwillingly, and saw a figure I already knew, the man in the dark overcoat. He stood there, before me, with a grim smile and empty eyes, as if he had been part of this all along. But what really left me speechless was what he said next. "You were always the key, Ricardo. Your lineage was always the key. You didn't know it, but you were always destined for this. The artifact, the city, the cult, all of it was orchestrated to get you here." My legs began to give way. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Everything I believed, all the choices I had made up until that moment, seemed futile in the face of the cruel truth that lay before me. I wasn't just involved with this cult, I was an essential part of it. My own bloodline had been chosen for this, to unleash what lay hidden beneath the city. I tried to resist, tried to deny what was happening, but the man's words echoed in my mind. How had I not realized it before? How could I have been so blind that I hadn't seen that I was being manipulated all along? But before I could react, the ground beneath me began to shake. The inscriptions on the wall glowed brightly, a pulsing light that seemed to grow in intensity by the second. I felt the weight of the growing power, and in that moment, I realized the cult didn't just want to perform a ritual. They wanted to open a portal. They wanted to free something that should remain trapped forever. I tried to run, tried to get out of that place, but the doors slammed shut, and darkness engulfed everything. The air became thick, almost impossible to breathe, and I knew time was running out. I had to stop this, no matter what. The cult man approached, his smile wider now. He knew I had nowhere left to run. It is done. The portal has been opened. The power that slumbered beneath the city will now be unleashed. And it was at that moment, when the light in the room went out completely and the wind began to howl, that the biggest surprise of all happened. A dull rumble, as if a great force were being unleashed, echoed off the walls. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by panic, something inside me clicked. Something inside me, something ancient, finally understood. I wasn't just there to stop the cult. I was the key to shutting it all down. In a rush of pure adrenaline, I looked at the artifact, which was still in my hands. The same strange sensation I'd felt before returned, and I knew what I had to do. The inscriptions on the artifact began to glow as well, as if responding to my intention. I was connected to it in a way I didn't fully understand, but I knew I had to use it to stop the ritual. The figure of the man in the service, who had started to approach me, stopped. He looked at me with a surprised, almost perplexed look. You can't control this." But it was too late. With a scream, I raised the artifact, and in that instant, the energy I'd sensed in the room was channeled. A burst of intense, nearly blinding light illuminated the room, causing everything around me to crumble. What happened next was confusing, like a whirlwind of light and sound. The cultist was thrown backward, his screams of pain mixing with the sounds of destruction. The walls began to crack, and I felt the ground tremble as if the city itself were being ripped from its foundations. The power that had been unleashed was now being controlled, or perhaps contained, by me. I knew, in that moment, that everything I had done up until that point was a choice. A choice to save the city, and to finally escape the curse that had lingered in my bloodline for centuries. The light finally began to fade. The destruction stopped, and the cult fell silent. I, now exhausted, fell to the ground, still clutching the artifact that had changed everything. But looking around, I realized the battle wasn't over. I had lost much, but the city was safe. At least for now. What happened next changed my perception of life, death, and the power of certain choices. The cult was defeated, but the truth I discovered would haunt me forever. After the chaos, silence fell. What seemed like the end was actually just the beginning of a new reality. The city, still intact, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, but the weight of what I had just experienced could not be easily erased. I knew what happened that night would change my life forever, but the most painful realization was that, even though I had defeated the cult, the artifact's power still resided within me. It had become part of who I am now. When I finally left that ancient building, with the first light of day breaking the darkness, the weight of responsibility weighed heavily on my shoulders. The cult had been defeated, but what they were trying to unleash had not been completely destroyed. I still held the key to something no one else could control. And worst of all, I knew this was a truth I would have to carry, perhaps for the rest of my life. The normally bustling city streets were quiet, as if a temporary peace had settled in. But the city wasn't the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. And when I thought about what had happened, what I could have prevented, all the lives that could have been lost, I couldn't help but wonder, does evil always find a way back? I had defeated a cult, but I knew the power they sought to unleash wouldn't disappear. It was still within me, within everyone connected to the artifact. That dog, that lost animal, was the key to everything. He brought us here, he showed us the way. And it was thanks to him that, somehow, I was able to resist the temptation of power and make the right decision. If I had given in to that, if I had allowed the cult to win, the city, and perhaps the world, would have been lost. The dog's gaze, as he handed me the artifact, stayed with me for a long time. As if he knew that, deep down, he was more than just a rescued animal. He was the last line of defense against something much bigger than any of us could imagine. And even with everything that's happened, I know that somehow there's still something more to understand. The cycle isn't over, and the real question lingering is, who will be ready when the artifact's power tries to break free again? I was the key, but could anyone be the key to stopping it all again? In that moment, as I walked through the empty streets, a strange sense of mission accomplished settled in, but also a shadow of doubt. I had done what I could. The city was safe, but the truth is, we don't know what the future holds. What I do know, without a doubt, is that our responsibility to what we encounter, to the power we touch, is something we cannot ignore. And that's when I realized that, in the end, saving a life, no matter how simple, is saving an entire world. Because, in the end, saving a life is saving an entire world.